Hello and welcome to the Symposium, and today we're going to be asking ourselves, why do we enjoy tragedy? Seems a bit weird when you think about it, and an awful lot of thought has been put into this by people with far greater minds than mine, and so I'm going to start reading a script that I've written in advance to this, so I don't mess any of this up, because it's very complicated, and also very undecided, I would say. I don't think that anyone has really nailed down a good reason yet, which is not what you might have expected for something that, again, was first created in ancient Greece, so 2,500 years ago, roughly. These theatre plays were performed in amphitheatres and involved a cast of characters with dialogue, music, dance, and a chorus. The philosophical conundrum of tragedy was remarked upon by Plato, who wondered at the moral implications of a crowd of his fellow citizens enjoying such a demonstration of pain and suffering being played out on the stage. The crowd enjoyed the event, and this enjoyment was intensified the greater the skill of the playwright. The more impactful and more horrific a tragedy being the one that was most appreciated. Aristotle's Poetics is in many ways a reply to his mentor Plato, and is the classic analysis of tragedy in which he associates it with pleasure involving the emotions. While slightly different, this is essentially what we would call today aesthetics, the philosophy of art. Tragedy in this context refers primarily to an invented story of human action in the form of a dramatic narrative. Classic examples of ancient tragedies would be Oedipus Rex and Medea, Othello and King Lear as Shakespearean tragedies, and Citizen Kane and... I was going to make a joke then, but I won't do it. Citizen Kane and The Godfather 2 being examples of modern tragedies. Look, all I'm saying is Finding Nemo has tragedy in it, okay? The general structure of a tragedy is as follows. A person who is normal enough for us to identify with is put into a bad situation of their own making, and this makes their life one of suffering and personal destruction. From their own actions falls upon them dire suffering from which there is no escape and serves no other purpose. The audience is encouraged to emotionally identify with the protagonist so that they too can feel the full force of the destruction of the character's life as the result of all too possible circumstances that perhaps they too could be possibly forced to endure. The paradox of tragedy is why this form of art is held up to be one of the greatest and most moving. If the narrative is, purposefully, one of the most tremendous suffering and hardship, why is the appropriate reaction to watching an expertly crafted tragedy one of pleasure? Are we all sadists for enjoying a graphic depiction of circumstances that would otherwise be considered extremely negative and painful, to which we would in real life be extremely sympathetic and personally distressed, and do everything we could to avoid? Scottish philosopher David Hume, 18th century philosopher, addressed this in his short essay Of Tragedy, which was published in 1757, in which he attempts to address this paradox. In it, he refers to French writers Dubois and Fontenelle, and draws upon contemporary literature of his day. He sets up his case using fictional examples, which are understood to be fictional, but then pivots and uses Cicero's oration against Verus from the late Roman Republic to illustrate that even examples that have a grounding in reality can be used to elicit the same emotional effect on an audience, demonstrating that it isn't only because the examples are fictional that the audience can enjoy this to the same degree. Naturally, then, this heightens the question, what the hell is wrong with us? Hume begins Of Tragedy by observing that the structure of tragedy is to give the protagonist small peaks to deepen the troughs, in order to elicit a more powerful effect on the audience, and this is an effect they crave as part of the performance. He says, they are pleased in proportion as they are afflicted, and are never so happy as when they employ tears, sobs, and cries to give vent to their sorrow and relieve their heart, swollen with the tenderest sympathy and compassion. He notes that few critics in his time attempt to account for it, and cites L'Abbe Dubois, who believed that nothing was worse than boredom, and to alleviate it, they take all manner of entertainment, gambling shows, executions, etc., to rouse the passion. But Hume notes that were the tragedy really occurring before our eyes, it would put us into a state of unfeigned uneasiness and cause us great distress. Fontenelle, he says, proposes a theory as to why we enjoy the fiction of tragedy, while we revile it if it were to be happening in reality. Pleasure and pain, he says, are sentiments that are so different from one another in results, but they often do not differ much in their cause. He uses the example of tickling, which the motion that produces pleasure can go too far and produce pain instead. I'm not sure that I agree that it's necessarily an accurate fit for the emotional experience of a theatre or the physical experience of being tickled, but that's not my argument. He believed this diminished the pain of events portrayed to a sufficient amount to convert them into pleasure. While we weep for the misfortune of the hero, we comfort ourselves by knowing that it is but fiction. In this mixture of sentiments, the affliction of our passions is stronger than our internal reassurance that it is a fiction, overwhelms our response, and makes the predominant symptom a pleasurable sorrow. Hume finds this explanation a just and convincing one, except that it fails to explain why the passions are excited in the same degree when we look at the orations of Roman statesman Cicero recounting Verus' massacre. Hume described this as a masterpiece of its kind, and yet was describing events of which Cicero's audience and the judges were convinced were completely real. Why is it such a beautiful piece to read, and why does it raise a pleasure from the bosom of uneasiness? Hume's answer is that the genius of Cicero's composition, quote, overpowers the terrible nature of the events being recounted and converts sorrow into pleasure. In Hume's view, it is only possible because of the gravity of the subject matter. To use such rhetorical gifts on mundane matters would not only be a waste, but it would instead make these gifts seem ridiculous. But when joined to passion, as he phrases it, such impulses arising from sorrow, compassion, indignation, receive new direction from sentiments of beauty. Hume believed that beauty, being a predominant emotion, takes control of the whole mind. You can see how fuzzy this whole argument is, can't you? Anyway, it takes control of the whole mind and converts the previous passions into itself, or alters them to such a degree as to change their nature and make the whole experience delightful. Hume argues that because tragedy is an imitation, which is one by its own nature agreeable, this smooths the feeling into one uniform and strong enjoyment. The excitement caused the excitement caused is transformed by the force of this emotional state and softens the passion. I don't agree with Hume here. I think this is mumbo jumbo, but I won't interrupt myself reading my own script. This does not happen when one is truly afflicted by sorrow, except perhaps for men who have found themselves fallen in some torporous state and need any kind of passion to rouse them from it. And to confirm his theory, Hume uses the examples of novelty, jealousy, difficulty, and absence to demonstrate that difficulties increase the intensity of the passions and allow us to convert what is painful into that which can be pleasurable. And yes, there's going to be a lot of people pointing out that, hey, that sounds like a lot of leftist males. Hume believes that these examples demonstrate that it is not paradoxical that orators and entertainers use our imaginations to bring out the delights of the mind, and that the finer arts engage the passions to bring us the highest entertainment. To confirm this reasoning, Hume suggests that we may observe that if the engagement of our imaginations is not predominant above the passions, then a contrary effect follows, and the imagination, instead of mollifying our passions and converting the painful into the pleasurable, instead serves to heighten the suffering of the person afflicted, which, if we were to summarize this in one example, no one would seek to comfort a grieving parent with a dramatic or rhetorical flourish regarding their own child's death. So maybe Hume has a point here. In summary, Hume believed that the pleasures may be taken from a variety of aspects of a tragedy, and that these can amount to a single sense of enjoyment. Hume thought that too much of one passion extinguishes the thrill of the performance. He does also note that there are going to be some acts too vile for even the greatest orator to express at the same time and convert the pain of hearing them into pleasure, and uses the example of a contemporary play called The Ambitious Stepmother, which apparently, I haven't read it myself, but apparently was absolutely abominable. And finally, for the audience to enjoy tragedy and leave satisfied, there must be an ending that can be considered just, such as a virtue becoming, quote, noble, courageous despair, or a vice that receives its proper punishment. What Hume called the strange feature of spectators of a tragedy is that the more the tragedy makes them feel that what would otherwise be negative emotions, the more they enjoy it. So the deeper effect on their emotions, the greater the joy gained from the performance, despite these playing on what Hume calls the uneasy passions. Hume lists sorrow, terror, and anxiety as the negative emotions from which people can draw. Sorrow is the consequence of a dramatic loss that the person feels deeply and lastingly, which can generally never be recovered. Terror is the fear of mortal danger to one's person or a loved one in the form of a life-changing injury or death, and anxiety is a more subtle and usually lingering sense of dread about the terrible events that might occur beyond one's power, and therefore beyond one's ability to control and mitigate. Hume believed the process of conversion was by which the negative passions generated from the terrible nature of events recounted were, quote, overpowered and effaced by stronger positive passions drawn from the aesthetic of their delivery. The emotional effect of Cicero's orations comes from the eloquence with which the scene is represented, and in Hume's opinion, produces the highest satisfaction in the audience. He observed that this force of oratory must, of course, be connected with a passion to make it exquisite, otherwise it becomes ridiculous. But he believed that the force of the impulse is generated by the passion it is derived from. And so in this case, he gives example of negative passions, but instead the feeling of being unpleasant to the one experiencing it is somehow smoothed over and converted into being a pleasure. In not just being a pleasure, but to one uniform and strong feeling of enjoyment. But it's not explained quite how. Hume also fails to address the question of the ambitious stepmother then. So if it is that there are some things that are just too disgusting or horrific or atrocious to be able to soften no matter how eloquently they're performed, why is that a special case? What is it that prevents us from being able to enjoy these? Why are these too strong? Why are these stronger than the others? Why couldn't the others be as strong as these? There are lots of unanswered questions in this regard, and this is why I don't find Hume especially persuasive at this point. A response to Hume's Of Tragedy was written by a Dr. Susan L. Feegan in a work called The Pleasures of Tragedy, and she begins the work summarising Hume's argument and then comes to her first point of contention, which is one I've just raised. What does Hume actually mean? She believes that Hume's argument fails to provide clarity on just how the knowledge, the work is fictional or the aesthetic quality of it, predominates over any unpleasant feelings regarding the piece, and Hume's described process of conversion by the imagination, instead of being mitigated, they are transformed into something else, but Hume is just unable to explain how this is done, and he substitutes, as she says, one puzzle for another. So she abandons the question of imagination and the passions in her attempt to explain why we derive pleasure from watching tragedies, and presupposes that we have, among others, two specific kinds of responses to art: a direct response and a meta-response, and this is the framework with which she uses to build her theory. She says, the direct response is a response to the qualities and content of the piece. The meta-response is our response to our direct responses. This means that the direct response is how we feel about the aesthetics of the thing and the entertainment value of the art, and the meta-response is how we feel about our reactions and the judgments that we made in the heat of the moment. Feegan believes that the direct and meta responses happen in everyday life as well as in experiencing art. She uses the examples of curiosity about a car crash, sexual adventurism, failure to meet a challenge, or her own lack of sympathy for a grieving friend to demonstrate this. She also notes that the words being used to describe direct and meta responses do not always distinguish between the two, because it's not something that people have been thinking about to try and distinguish between. In her view, direct responses play on our feelings, and when done in art, it is often with the purpose of making the experience feel quite visceral, so many people fail to draw pleasure from them at all and instead avoid them. If this is the case, where is the pleasure derived? And this is true. There are people who just don't enjoy tragedy or horror movies or anything like that. And so if this is not universal, how are we identifying it? Her solution is the meta-response, which is our self-examination and self-congratulation for having the morally correct responses to the immoral acts represented in the art. She speculates that we are pleased to find ourselves the kind of people who respond negatively to injustice, and this gives us pleasure by reassuring us that we care for the welfare of others and reminds us of our common humanity. Feegan then wonders why tragedies are considered more significant than comedies. She argues that one might think the greatness of tragedies comes from a belief that man is doomed to suffer, and that tragedy confirms that. But if tragedy is essentially terrible, are we also essentially terrible for indulging in it? She argues that the greatness of tragedy comes not from a morbid desire to see evil, but because we feel sympathy with our fellow man. She says that at the foundation of the aesthetic pleasure from tragedy is the same feeling which makes possible moral action: sympathy with and a concern for the welfare of human beings qua human beings. She believes that our judgments about the aesthetic significance of tragedy as compared to comedy comes from tragedy's abilities to call forth feelings which are also at the basis of morality, making tragedy a form of moral expression. In essence, this means that tragedy is deeper than comedy and requires our ability to empathize with others for us to even enjoy it. Feegan brings up John Ruskin's idea of the selfish sentimentalist to introduce the problem of induced feelings. Even if a person indulges in heightened emotions during a performance of a play, that same person could be indifferent to the causes of those emotions in real life, and instead could be indulging in a selfish pride of their own emotional reaction and not have a concern with the human welfare from which one would derive virtue. This would essentially be virtue signalling. This concept is used by Gilbert Ryle, who says that sentimentalists, as he has coined the term, indulge in induced feelings without recognizing that they are fictitious. The subject of a play is fictional, and any moral feeling towards them dissolves once the story is over. There is no genuine desire of the welfare of a fictional character. All sentiments around it are, at least in the performance, simulated. We might have genuine sentimental attachment to our own experience of the performance, but we cannot make a fictional character real. I just want to break from my script here for a second. Say, try and use... next time you see someone being sentimental on social media and being stunning and brave and virtuous on Twitter or Facebook, ask yourself if this is what's happening. Ask yourself if they are indulging in induced feelings without recognizing that there is essentially a fiction about it. Even if the story being recounted is true, which in many cases I'm sure that it's not, I still think there is this kind of simulacra at play. The, oh, I'm so sorry for you person on the internet who I don't actually know and whose status update I'm sure would make... if I were to put myself in your place and kind of imagine a rush of empathy into this, the vessel that has been carved out by the description of what's happened, then yes, you would feel you would feel these feelings, but it would still essentially be fictitious because you would look around and realise that there's nothing here. It was all just numbers on a screen. But anyway, and just a thought. Anyway, Feegan criticises this by saying that a person might genuinely care for others, but not for themselves, and only in the theatre can they express this in comfort, while in their real life, self-interest takes predominance, so they don't express themselves. It isn't that the person's concern for others disappears, but we are all naturally required to take care of ourselves first. She identifies another way that we might understand our sympathetic responses and meta-responses. If we were to identify with a particular fictional character out of our self-interest and investment into it alone, although not a general concern for others, she introduces us to the other side of this problem with her unimaginative moralist, a person with exemplary behaviour but no investment in the fiction. Feegan explains that this is a lack of imagination in the aesthetic context of art, but not in the actual moral context. She questions why a pleasurable response to fiction is appropriate and whereas the same response would be inappropriate in reality. We wouldn't enjoy the suffering of a friend, because it would be a real thing and we'd have empathy for that person. She concludes that exploring these emotions in real life is not usually possible, as the importance of the events overshadows our ability to indulge and explore our own emotions, but in fiction we can generally have sympathy for imagined suffering, and we are not conflicted by genuine concern for another person. It is, after all, fictional. Feegan notes that in real life it is smug to be satisfied with our own feelings and pleasurable meta-responses, which are foreclosed, in her words, by unpleasant direct responses derived from the real nature of events. The meta-response to art is a form of closure so we can properly analyse our own responses to it, our own meta-responses. The meta-responses are not always appropriate or inappropriate in real life, and are context-dependent. She thinks it's desirable to be self-critical of our own meta-responses so we can improve as people, which is true. The meta-response of pleasure we feel for art is appropriate because in art there is no real suffering to continue to weigh on our feelings, unlike in life. So in conclusion, Feegan believes that our meta-response is a kind of self-commentary on our own empathetic response to art and the moral questions raised by it. Feegan criticises Hume for not providing a clear explanation of how one emotion becomes predominant over another and the process of this conversion, and she also observes that Hume fails to explain that why some cases of extreme unpleasantness are too extreme for us to derive pleasure from, such as the example of the ambitious stepmother, or what his criteria for leaving this out would be. She also makes the point that many people do not feel a sense of pleasure from their meta-responses, finding that the experience depresses them rather than uplifts them. The distress induced by the fiction is not restricted only to their time in the theatre and persists. Instead of bringing pleasure, the experience makes them maudlin and torporous of the futility of life. Feegan then cites Mill and points out that something directly unpleasant can be a cure for ennui and rouse the mourner back to action, which brings her back to the original question of how do we derive pleasure from tragedy? So when it comes to what it is about our distressing response that pleases us when we analyse our own meta-responses, Feegan suggests that the pleasure itself is a meta-response that comes from our reaction to the distress experienced in our direct response. The thing we are actually deriving pleasure from is our reflection about the response and the self-affirmation that we derive from it. It's not just that we find comfort in the fact that we responded humanely, it's that we derive moral satisfaction and self-righteousness from our own ability to be compassionate, and that our compassion is tied to the suffering of human beings, even if only simulated, is what makes us worthy. In Feegan's view, it reinforces to us that we are morally upstanding people who oppose villainy, treachery, and injustice, and this gives us satisfaction that we can consider ourselves to be decent human beings. In addition to this, Feegan believes that it also makes one feel less isolated from humanity, and helps us to feel less alone in the world by engaging in a kind of shared feeling of distress. Feegan rejects what she considers to be a simplistic explanation of tragedy, that it is due to some essential morbidity of the people who consider tragedy to be greater than comedy, as she believes this would mean that tragedy's significance is that it draws the true picture of man's ignoble lot, doomed to suffer for his whole life only to die, and by this logic, tragedy would only confirm the nastiness of existence, making any pleasure derived from it entirely morbid. She posits that our appreciation of tragedy is contingent on our ability to empathise and sympathise with our fellow man, and is directly linked to the same impulses that form our basis of morality, as I said earlier. If her conception of the pleasurable response is correct, then we are feeling pleasure from tragedy from our ability to form an emotional bond with the person who is suffering the tragic circumstances, not that we are feeling pleasure because we enjoy watching someone suffer. We take pleasure from our ability to form such connections, and this is based on our moral values, which are sprung from our ability to form a moral commitment to another person, at least in her view. Feegan believes that the greater aesthetic significance of tragedy over comedy is due to the fact that it calls forth these feelings in us, and that's what she believes is the basis of morality. As she goes on to describe, comedy requires the butt of a joke, and so it can't really be based on feelings of morality, as by definition it requires someone to whom we are not giving moral consideration, and we are instead ridiculing them. Feegan also observes that the characteristics targeted by comedy are considered to be insignificant, and if we turn comedy towards the significant, it would gain the air of tragedy and seem cruel. This is why a lot of people don't appreciate dark humour. But again, it's one of those ways of appreciating and coping with terrible ideas, and in many ways empathising with them as well. But that's a different video. Because of the insignificance of comedy, we usually do not have meta-responses to analyse afterwards. Why would we? It was insignificant. Feegan has a potential problem here, though, as she cannot yet explain in a manner consistent with her thesis how an immoral person could respond positively to the aesthetics of a performance, or how a moral person could fail to respond to those same aesthetics. These are described in the terms selfish sentimentalist and unimaginative moralist, respectively. The selfish sentimentalist indulges in simulated situations to induce strong feelings, in which they can take pleasure. Again, pay attention to people on social media, because I believe this is something that we see a lot on social media. Their pleasure does not come from a meta-response feeling of self-satisfaction due to their moral rectitude, as they are not necessarily moral people, and instead is a selfish pleasure that does not speak to moral values. The unimaginative moralist is the flip side of the coin, and while he is a moral person in his day-to-day life, he does not appreciate the aesthetic qualities of a fictional creation and cannot lose himself in a story that is not based in reality. Feegan observes that the selfish sentimentalist might really be a person who is particularly guarded and prioritizes immediate self-interest over concern for others. This person must be in a comfortable space, such as a theatre, so that there is no risk to oneself to indulge in these emotions. The person's ability to express their concern for others is particularly contextual. The unimaginative moralist is certainly not someone whose sympathy is overwhelmed by self-interest. Feegan's answer to the unimaginative moralist is that it requires more effort of imagination to generate an emotional reaction to a work of art than it does to react to real events. In the case of a real-world event, the reaction is usually involuntary and thrust upon us, whereas with a work of art we must spend time and energy becoming invested in the piece in order to appreciate the aesthetic qualities of it. The unimaginative moralist is not morally deficient, he is just aesthetically lazy. Feegan claims that the possibility of the selfish sentimentalist and the unimaginative moralist presents no genuine problem for her theory, but I have to say I find her explanation of these two tropes unconvincing. While there may well be people who represent these ideas, I don't think they are comprehensive categorization of the kinds of people who will fall outside of her theory, as it presumes that everyone has this kind of deep moral sense of connectedness to other human beings and relies upon that. It is not that the selfish sentimentalist is really selfish, it is that they are timid and have presumably heightened and sensitive ideas as to what constitutes personal danger, and this concern overwhelms their compassion for others. But this does not account for the possibility that there could be people who are genuinely sadistic and actually do lack compassion and empathy for others, and actually enjoy seeing people suffer. And perhaps part of that is indulging in these kind of direct and meta responses. The unimaginative moralist also leaves a hole in Feegan's theory by her description of him simply not putting in the effort in order to appreciate art. Any enjoyment of cultural products is subjective, and I believe that there could be people who genuinely lack aesthetic feelings towards certain kinds of art, and perhaps even all art, on subjective grounds that can't necessarily be reproduced in others. It is not simply that the person is not trying to enjoy a piece of art, it is that they do not derive aesthetic pleasure from it for personal reasons, and no matter how hard they try, it might well be a futile endeavour. Despite this, the person could still be a good and moral person, of course. Feegan admits that her position leaves us with an asymmetry between our responses, between art and life. But is she correct here? It could be that one believes that a pleasurable meta-response to art or life is inappropriate given the subject matter, or that satisfaction with oneself for feeling compassion for others is not restricted only to fiction, but applies in real life as well. So I hope this has been interesting, and I honestly don't know where I stand on this. I find Hume's conversion of the pain and pleasure to be unconvincing. I don't think that's what anything is, and he can't give us any kind of mechanism to explain this. But I think I find Feegan's explanation of the direct and meta response to be slightly abstract and contrived, perhaps not. That sounds pejorative, but I feel that it only explains a certain kind of person, the sort of smug, self-satisfied art critic type. I don't think most people are that actually self-critical and self-aware when they deal with this. I suppose that if I had to come up with my own theory, I would suggest that, Hume actually, he pointed out his observation that we enjoy imitation for its own sake, right? And I think that what we're seeing is the enjoyment of emotion. And it probably is down to Fontenelle's people do anything but be bored, They particularly enjoy these emotions. But I think a part of it is also the sort of danger of these emotions. You never really want to be in a circumstance where you suffer terrible loss or, deep sorrow. But because, and I don't think most people do very regularly suffer from deep sorrow. And so I think a way of experiencing this aspect of the human condition and not doing it and not having it forced upon you means that you get to choose to indulge in it, and so you can feel what this set of feelings is like and be more appreciative of the fact that you don't have this on a regular basis and this isn't your life going on. And you do it through, I guess, the theatre, the simulated experience of the tragedy is a kind of simulacrum. It creates an environment. It creates I don't know how to describe it. An emotional structure from which you can pour in your own emotions, take on the feelings that would be appropriate in those positions, even if they're terribly sad and make you cry, make you feel pain. And you do it knowing that it is a simulation, that it is a false thing, and it's only because it's a false thing that you can do it. But again, I'm no expert in this in any regard. I've just been studying tragedy slightly. This is not a very deep analysis either, but I was amazed at the kind of depth of thought that's gone into trying to understand why we enjoy tragedy. But anyway, I hope this gave you something interesting to think about, and I'll see you in the next video.